Hello and welcome to Northampton Community College's Ethics and Moral Problems course. This presentation on equality and fairness will look at the philosophical works and writings of Mary Wollstonecraft and Simone de Beauvoir. It's really uncertain whether or not those names are familiar to you. They're not really names one hears in popular conversation, but they have laid the groundwork for much of what we hear in the public sphere, today concerning women's rights and feminism, and of course, history is still being written. But Wollstonecraft, even though she came quite early, herself stood on the shoulders of those who came prior. Anyway, I hope this brief introduction, spurs some interest in these two great philosophical thinkers for you. Now, first off, with Mary Wollstonecraft, notice the few number of years this good woman spent on the planet. You may have read that her father put them into poverty with his drinking, and to make matters worse, he was also physically abusive. There's a lot about her life that is tragic. Her sister's death, her unorthodox, maybe we should just say unconventional love affair, out of wedlock pregnancy, attempted suicide twice, and unfortunately she developed septicemia, this bacterial blood disorder after the birth of her second child. And then she had died at age 38 following that pregnancy. As a side note, the child born from that tragic event was also named Mary and went on to marry a man with the last name of Shelley, and she then became the famous author Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein. Anyway, like most people in life, all our experiences help shape who we are as human persons. So she came of age during this tumultuous time of the French Revolution, the philosophical eras of the Enlightenment. So think of emphasis, placed on reason. It was just starting to wane, and it was the onset of the Romantic period. So think of the power of the sensual. So these were blended years philosophically. She was also a radical for her time, and I imagine she would stand in that line today. And what she understood, at least the liberating rights of women, is something that she held as nothing more than natural rights. And reason dictated this. And those rights were an extension simply of God's justice here on earth. So the exercise of reason in one's life was the necessary means of woman's full and a proper place in the polis, or we'd say the community. Now, this reasoning ability extends also to her understanding of marriage. So none of that silly romantic love, but a reasoned relationship with the husband and the wife, did not overdo their level of intimacy. Though, some of that waned as she herself fell deeply in love with William Goldwyn, who was the father of their daughter Mary Shelley. As a first-wave feminist, if we can use such a term, provided we know that she herself was not literally the first, Wollstonecraft held to the equality of men and women, but obviously that was not something commonly thought of as true or genuine in the 18th century. In terms of morality, rationality, and intelligence, she held the female and the male just were on the same level. And if there was a discrepancy between males and females in those regards, it was purely aspects of the differing education and the social status that they might have been in. Now it was thought by society at the time overall that women were to be held in esteem, as long as they espoused the typical traits expected by society. That is, a woman should simply be passive and dependent. But Wollstonecraft said logic dictates that if this passive and dependent, is something constructed and developed within the familial structures, then it's going to be at the level of the family where some change has to occur. So I guess one could say that the change must begin at home. Now, this change that Wollstonecraft thought was simply not, good just for the woman. In other words, she recognized these factors of equality with men as something that was good for society as a whole. So what was good for the woman was also good for society. We could say it that way. In a way, then, recognizing equality and justice for the woman was just one more way to provide equality and justice for the society as a whole. Now, Wollstonecraft understood God's design as evident in the human person, and from that there was this personal, independence that was necessary for all human development, and this was intended by God. So this independence is part of human nature and being good for the human person. It should be extended as a good for the whole political sphere where justice plays out. Now the understanding of the human person and the relationship to the polis, this also formed her moral philosophy. The human person was to be strong in mind and body, and each, and this is both male and female, really need to use reason to cultivate the moral virtue within themselves. Now this was not meant to disregard the sensitive aspects of the person. Again, female and males alike. But the rational should always rule the emotional and the sensual, not the other way around. Now, she did part ways with what most would consider to be true of women in modern day feminism. She did lean towards the males having a superiority in virtue, and though she did understand the woman as equal, she did say and think that the woman would find her duties primarily in the domestic sphere. Okay, on to Simone de Beauvoir. We find a feminist here probably more in line with the modern comprehension of the term feminism. Though, of course, de Beauvoir was a woman whose life extended through most of the 20th century and eventually, maybe not her personally per se, but those who built upon her ideas, really became part of what is now termed second wave feminism. And her political views were formed in part as a reaction against her parents' and bourgeoisie conservative values. And Simone jettisoned also her family's religious views, and she herself became an atheist while still very young. As opposed to Wollstonecraft's acceptance as a domestic sphere being the woman's domain, here de Beauvoir said no and took up writing and studying as her own occupation. Romantically, on that note, while still at a very young age, 21 years old, she met Jean-Paul Sartre, the famous French existential philosopher. Now, they had an open relationship. She herself was bisexual. And these were, of course, forms of sexual liberation that were on the margins of society in the early decades of the 20th century. But more importantly to her philosophical project is that she eventually understood her relationship with Sartre, as the shadow from which under she never really could be allowed to escape. So in 1949, de Beauvoir published her book, The Second Sex. Now, this book marked a movement within her. As she herself considered, well, let's say this way, she considered herself a female who admittingly did not necessarily sense the obvious disadvantages that females historically have endured. Now, she was aware of them for certain, and she wrote of them at length, in various historical treatments, particularly in the book The Second Sex. But as part of the reflection on her relationship with Sartre, she came to realize that woman was the other. Now, what she meant by this was that the female is not identified as a female per se, but only as a male. Only as not male. In other words, the female simply was the second sex. She felt here that what was understood of an injustice was simply part of a larger aspect of social justice. So if the woman was seen as other, basically as not male, then what was really the issue with women's rights were really just something that can fall under the umbrella of all human rights. So feminism was primarily a human right. So you could see there's some tie-in to Wollstonecraft. Now, the opening lines of Book 2 of The Second Sex are perhaps among her most famous. And that is, one is not born, but rather becomes a woman. Now, what she meant was that much of what was thought to consist of being feminine was simply constructed under some patriarchal society. So part of that patriarchal structure was simply to create a status that kept the female as other. She was not denying the biological classification of female, but stating that gender, and that's an expression of feminism here, was not essential to being a female. Characteristics such as nurturing and caring, she contended, were not essential characteristics of being a female. They just developed under the social influences where the parameters, again, were from the male perspective, that first sex. Now, this is not the gender fluidity one would find in gender issues today. That would be very anachronistic to make such a claim. But one might find a sensitive underpinning in de Beauvoir. And those underpinnings, if we can call them that, they're all related to various factors. First, and let's say it this way. De Beauvoir and her husband Sartre, they were both existentialists. Fundamental to existentialism philosophy is the principle that existence precedes essence. Now according to this theory and related to feminism, human beings are isolated in the world with no purpose defined by their biological sex or what identity might come from some supernatural deity. Each person is only determined as who and what they are by the choices made in particular cultural environments. Okay, so in other words, to put it in a nutshell, one's essence is just all based on choices. Now gender, and remember, gender is not male or female. It's not sex. It's feminine and masculine. Okay, gender for her is one of those constructs that can be individually determined. Keep in mind, there are certainly other factors involved in these underpinnings. The science of biology. She was also influenced by Darwinian evolution. And it's important to include the influence of Marxist ideas and his theories of conflict and elements of oppression, right? So the other, as the second sex there, we could say, is being dominated by the first sex. And two, amongst all this, was the rise of Freudian psychoanalysis as it relates to human sexuality and consciousness. Now in that last note of consciousness, when you tie that into existentialism, there arises the notion that feminism is the response to some, threat perceived. So the other's consciousness is female, who in terms of the cultural patriarchy, they just allowed themselves to be subjugated by the male into a particular form of feministic gender. Basically, the male society has just formed these gender roles as a way to control the female. The opposition then, if you want to put it that way, is against any imposed gender role. It must be dismantled. And overcoming that domination, according to de Beauvoir, the female is liberated, can then exist as a being pour soi, or a being for itself, as purposeful and determined by their own existence. This would be opposed to the being in soi, or being in itself, which really is formed by cultural conditions. Nonetheless, if you want to place Simone de Beauvoir in the broader context of feminism, you could maybe think of Mary Wollstonecraft as the first wave of feminism, where the laws and perhaps the social structures, were oppressing the female and distorting the nature of the woman. By contrast, de Beauvoir is just denying that there is even is a female nature, and that the oppression is as deep as the female's consciousness being formed by this patriarchy. So with her, changing laws, we're really not going to change that deteriorating effect, according to her view, because the assumptions that are evident in the present legislation, whatever it might be, would simply reappear in any revised legislation, and the initial oppression would persist because it's still a patriarchy determined the gender role of the woman. So the second wave feminism then, which we did not cover, of the 1960s, built off of de Beauvoir's ideas of rationality, and even that, what is deemed true and right, simply became vestiges of the patriarchal underpinning of society. And by the time the third wave feminism arose, we might call it postmodern, with anti-essentialism and such, that began in the early part of the 20th century, and today it's firmly in place. Anyway, I hope this brief presentation offers some insight into Mary Wollstonecraft and Simone de Beauvoir. They're really two important philosophical thinkers, and they can offer us, both perspective and insights into various points of view concerning the issue of equality and fairness. Thank you for listening.